Welcome, everyone. So as the title says, we're going to be talking today about analytics, in particular looking at a number of issues that are out there that are going to take us beyond what many people would consider to be cutting-edge practice right now, but I actually think still has a bit of a way to go in terms of getting the kinds of insights that we need. The agenda is to particularly look at how we can integrate both the enterprise way of looking at things, so this is how the people at the strategy level, the C-suite, look at it with their analytics, along with what we do on the HR side or on human capital analytics. When you bring the two of those together, that's how you can get the deepest insights to be able to really provide strategic value. To do that, we need to use models to identify what are the particular issues that need to be addressed, how we can get HR analytics focused on organizational effectiveness, and to provide a really strong business case that goes beyond just showing something like ROI. As Carrie said, this work is based in part on the book that I came out earlier this year called Employee Surveys at Work. That takes us from the perspective of looking at the kinds of data that are typically collected in organizations. How can we make that more strategic? How can we start to bring in things like models to be able to get to deeper insights? It's based even more so on a book that I'm just finishing up right now that's going to be released in the fall of next year called Strategic Analytics. And what you're getting here is going to be kind of a high-level sampling of some of the issues that are addressed in that book. So the agenda that we're looking for is, in particular, when you're talking about how you can get to deeper strategic insights, you want to start with the issues that are keeping your business leaders up at night. Okay. A lot of times in HR, people are asked to show what's the monetary impact of what you're doing. That's considered to be, one of the best things we can do is to show some kind of a bottom line impact. But as we all know, there are many different ways of measuring success. There's financial success, there's strategic success, and oftentimes the perspective that's taken by people in the finance function is different than what we get by people who are working in strategy. And what I'm focusing on here is what are the things we need to know to be able to be contributing to strategy? What kinds of data are going to provide the right insights for that? And how does that relate to the kinds of questions that HR is addressing today? So the kinds of questions that we want to be asking are looking at where is it that, as a whole, the organization's systems and processes are working well versus not, and what is it that can help us to get moving in that direction? Okay. The biggest problem that we have in HR, and this goes back for decades, is that when we formulate the HR strategy, we look at the business strategy. But as you go from the business strategy to the HR strategy, you have to make a bunch of compromises. We make those compromises not because we're trying to cut corners, but simply because translating the business strategy into an HR strategy, you have to focus on certain things. We focus on the people side of things. We focus less on what's happening on the business side. We make certain assumptions. So if we look at, say, a sales process, and we know we want to improve a sales process, then we're going to focus on things like sales competencies. But there are things that you miss when you do that. And that's one of the fundamental problems with translating the business strategy into an effective HR strategy that ultimately supports the business strategy. The further you get down the line, so going from the business strategy to the HR strategy, then HR programs, how you design them, and then ultimately how you implement them, you're making compromises each step along the way so that by the time you're done, what we end up with as an HR program is often very different than what the business needs to be able to impact the strategy, even though we design that program with the strategy in mind. So the point that analytics can help you with is to take a look at how things are after you've designed them, after you've implemented everything, and then go back and look at the strategy and say, how is it that we're actually effectively answering those questions? Not in a vacuum, like, could this help, but actually, where is it that it's helping us to improve with the strategy execution and helping us with our organizational effectiveness? That's the goal for this approach. So the question becomes, ultimately, you need to keep focusing on what are the problems that you're trying to solve, what are the strategic issues that we care about, and how does the HR data provide insights into those? So this graphic here is from an old fable. It comes from China. This is what we have here are a group of blind monks who are touching the different parts of an elephant. Now we have a modern day version of this is you might have three blind people who are, or blindfolded people who are touching the different parts of an elephant, and their task is to describe the elephant. And the problem, of course, is that each person is touching a different part and doesn't get a sense about the whole picture. Okay, so the person touching the tail thinks that the elephant is like a snake or a rope. The person touching the tusk thinks that it's long and smooth and pointed, and so on. Okay, this is the fact that this. So this is actually a piece of art that goes back many centuries and shows part of the problems that we have as humans in trying to make the best sense of what's the data that we have sitting right in front of us. And this actually is one of the key challenges and problems that we have in HR today when we're looking at analytics, when we're looking at trying to make sense of the data in front of us. Too often we focus only on the single pieces of information that we see right there. Now, we do this with good intentions. I mean, a lot of times we have brand new enterprise systems. We've got our new HRIT system. In fact, in a separate set of work that Jerry Ledford and I are working on, we're looking at this larger question of how is it that HR technology can impact the function of HR. And part of what we're finding there, which is not surprising, is that if you go and try to get insights based solely on the data that's sitting in front of you, you're kind of like this blind person feeling the elephant, because the existing data often only can tell you little pieces of information about what's going on in the whole system. You need to actually take a different approach, which is to look at the entire system, look at the whole animal, look at the whole elephant, and try to figure out what's going on with the whole system. And some of the information is going to come from the data that's right in front of you. Some of it's going to come from data that's not readily available. You have to go out and find it. Okay. Now, when we talk about HR data, there are three different ways that we can measure what kinds of impact HR has on the business. There is efficiency, which is how efficiently can we run our programs, which typically gets down to how much they cost. There is effectiveness, which is do they work as they are designed to work. Okay, if we have a performance management system, does that actually differentiate performance the way we want it to? Are we distributing rewards in line with people's actual contributions to productivity? Those are effectiveness questions. But ultimately, we want to know if they have a business impact. Just because we have a performance management system, just because it might differentiate performance, that doesn't necessarily mean that it is going to be incrementally adding to performance in the way that we want it to. You can say the same thing about leadership development, about recruiting, about looking at an internal promotion paths. In every single case, we can look at the program as it was designed, and if we then want to know how does that ultimately impact the business, it's a very different question often than is the program working as it was originally designed. Again, because that comes from the HR strategy without necessarily ensuring you're going back to what's the ultimate business impact you need to be having. So this, I put this little kind of diagram up to emphasize a point that is perhaps a little bit simplistic, but one that is important to keep in mind. Okay. A lot of times when we're looking at trying to evaluate the impact of HR, we're saying, how does this performance management system, how does this rewards program, how does this training program impact the business? And what we're saying there is that HR practices, we think, can lead directly to business results, if you're asking that kind of a question. That, of course, is a silly thing to say, because we don't think that it's HR in and of itself that is what drives business results. But anytime you ask that kind of a question without laying out the full steps that are involved, all the causal steps that take you from the different things that come together to create the outcomes, you're asking this kind of you're looking at this kind of a relationship, which of course is too simplistic. To get at what really matters, we want to understand what is it about business impact that will tell us what we need to know, what kinds of measures will tell us what we need to know. Now, ROI is something that's been out there for many, many years. I mean, this goes back to the beginning of the development of finance as a field. It, of course, is used by the finance function all the time when we're talking about we're trying to evaluate, should we be investing in different projects, different capital spending projects, new ventures we want to be trying out. ROI is supposedly the holy grail of how we're supposed to be measuring financial impact. But in fact, that's actually the fundamental problem with it, is it focuses on financial impact. So one of the big challenges with ROI is that you have to put anything you want to add into an ROI calculation has to be expressed in some kind of a monetary value. The problem is that many of the things that we do in organizations, in organization effectiveness, in organization development, within HR, many of the things that we do have impacts on processes where you can't make a direct link to an immediate financial benefit. So that leaves you with a problem. You either leave those things out of the ROI calculation, or you're forced to assign a value to them that many people could question. They could say, well, you're just making things up. There's no way we can actually guarantee that you're going to get that kind of return, say from improving how people communicate, how they might collaborate cross-functionally. If you look at the whole variety of things we try to accomplish in HR and OD, the majority of them are ones that you can't easily express in monetary value. And because of that, ROI is an incredibly deficient metric if you want to use that to look at the impact of HR. Now, the other problem with ROI, which really doesn't get talked about very much, is that because it's focused on monetary values, that means in financial terms we're really talking about how you impact short-term cash flow. Okay. Anything that is going to be impacting cash flow in the very long run, like what kinds of investment returns you might be getting many years out, you can put that into an ROI calculation, but if you're saying that we're not going to get a return on this project until 3 or 5 years down the line, that opens you up to the biggest challenges from the finance function, that what you're advocating really is going to be worthwhile. I mean, we do have those kinds of debates within our companies. They happen all the time around capital spending, but rarely ever do they happen around kind of building capability that happens through HR programs and processes. For those, finance is always asking for much more of a short run. Show me how this is going to give a return in the next 6 months, 12 months, maybe 18 months at the most. Well, that's all about short-term cash flow impacts. The problem is that in a strict accounting sense, you can create something that has positive ROI while actually degrading your ability to compete in the long run. Okay? Anything that's an investment where we're not going to be getting a return except one that happens over many years in the future, those kinds of spending are not, excuse me, sorry. Those kinds of spending are not going to give you a positive short-term ROI because they're not going to be giving you a positive short-term improvement in cash flow. In fact, it's usually the opposite. If we want to deliver long-term capability, that typically means we have to invest more now. So we're sacrificing short-term cash flow for the benefit of increased cash flow in the future. But those kinds of considerations are very difficult to capture within an ROI framework. The basic problem being that ROI is a single metric. It's supposed to tell you in one number what the monetary value is, and it's very difficult to express what the difference is in cash that you're going to be receiving in 6 months versus, say, in 6 years. And a lot of what we do in HR is about building the capability to maintain competitive advantage over a much longer term than the next 6 months. So what we really need to know is how is it that HR ultimately impacts competitive advantage? In order to get there, you need to focus on what are the actual organizational capabilities that create competitive advantage. So this gets back to what your true strategy is. Now, a strategy is not we're going to grow sales by 10%. A strategy is how is it that you uniquely create value for your customers, for your clients, in a way that your competitors cannot. So that's going to happen through quality. It'll happen through innovation. It happens through having a dominant distribution system. All the things that describe what your competitive advantage are. That's what you need to be thinking about when you're looking at what's the impact that what we do in HR ultimately on the business. And the analytics for that, which is the focus of the seminar I'm going to be holding in holding in January in Dallas, and also the book that's coming out next year, is specifically on what is the framework that you need to be able to address this. So here's an example of a causal model. I'm not going to go into too much detail on this, but you can take a look at what the different parts are. The components that go into individual performance, which is what's in the top half of the picture, and then organizational performance at the bottom are very similar. Okay. You have capability, which is the competencies the individual brings to the table. You have their motivation, how much they really want to participate, they want to be productive, and then how the job is designed, which enables them to be able to do their job. Those come together to effectively describe everything we need to know about how a job works, which tells us then about how that job performs, and then the business outcomes that we're trying to produce typically happen not through one person doing it, each person doing their job one person at a time, but through people coming together and combining their efforts and working together as groups. So that's where we get group behaviors, we get team effectiveness, all the things we measure on the bottom part of the slide. So it's a fairly simple way of describing organizational performance, but it also shows all of the key elements you want to be thinking about if you want to say, what is it that actually ultimately leads to the business results that we're trying to impact. So the question then is, where is it that HR actually comes into play here? Where is it that it makes a difference? So in this next slide, I've indicated that the main places where HR practices tend to have an impact. So they happen through capability, okay? The type of people that we hire, what kind of development opportunities we give them, how we train them, what kinds of experiences they have, what is it that we do to help them to be motivated? How is it that we reward them? How is it that we communicate, support them? So through the individual capability and the attitudes, so that's at the individual level in the top half. And then in the bottom half, we do a lot to try to influence what happens at the group level. So how effectively do teams come together? Are people working well? Are they supporting each other? So those are the three main ways that HR directly impacts things that ultimately impact the business. When you look at it here, so I'm going to quickly go back to the previous slide. So this is the one that showed a very simple relationship from HR practices directly to business results, which of course is too simplistic. Here we see it in its much more complex, nuanced way. Okay. So this is typically how HR does impact the business. The question then becomes, well, so if we don't have a direct line of sight between what HR is doing and directly into the business results, we have to ask, how is it that HR helps to improve individual capability, the motivation attitudes that people have to perform in their job, and then how the groups come together. But asking just how does HR impact each of those things, individual capability, individual attitudes, and group behaviors, doesn't tell us if it's actually having an impact on the business. It can tell us, is a contribution from HR moving in the right direction? But if those contributions are not what the business needs in order to solve the challenges that are getting in the way of business results, then what we do in HR may not be really important. Okay. Now, this is not to say that people are designing HR programs, to be ineffective. We're not saying that people are approaching things with an idea that they want to have very little impact on the business. The problem is that when you design HR programs and you evaluate them looking simply from an HR lens, without making a direct link back to what is the business trying to accomplish through the capabilities you're trying to build, through the various pieces that come together to create the business results, if you're not looking at that larger picture, then you're you're going to come to very misleading conclusions about what it is that HR, how it is that HR actually does contribute to the business results, if at all. So here is a fairly detailed look at the kinds of steps that are involved for doing an analysis that will get you to understanding what the business impact is. I know you don't have these slides in front of you, so you can't be looking at them side by side, but I'll just kind of page back and forth so you can see. The three parts, so in the bottom of this slide, you've got the job design, individual capability, and the attitudes and motivation. That is the same on the upper left on this slide. So that's what ultimately contributes to individual performance, is how the individual capability, job design, and attitudes come together. So we have that on the bottom of this slide. Okay. Now, what I've done here is I've reversed things. On this causal model slide, what we're saying is that you start with individual capability, individual job design, and in the worker attitude, and that tells you ultimately is that person doing their job, and then you can look how that job ultimately contributes to group performance and then business results. So that's the causal model that tells you, are you getting what you need in order to have the right business results? But from an analytics perspective, because you have to, there's so many things you can look at to try to understand what's driving the ultimate business performance. In order to figure out what you should be focusing on, you actually start the other way around. So you start at the organizational level, which I have at the top of the slide here. You start with the organization design, organizational capability, and then the culture that you have and the kind of the team and the group norms. Okay. You need to do a diagnostic on those first and figure out where is it that things have been designed well or not at the organization level, at the work design level, to see, you know, what are the challenges that are created by the decisions that are made at the executive suite. So when annual budgeting decisions are made, when you're setting the strategic goals for the next year and like looking out 2 to 3 years, senior leaders make very important decisions about how much money is going to be spent on different things. They make assumptions about, you know, who is going to have responsibility for doing what types of tasks, who's going to have ultimate decision-making authority to, you know, when in cases of ties, where is it you're going to be pushing decision-making down further in the hierarchy. All of those decisions about organization design and about strategy setting have direct implications for how effective people are in their individual jobs. So for the analytics, you actually need to start at that organizational level. You start with what is going on with a strategy, with the annual budgeting, what kind of implications does that then have for bolstering the organizational strengths that we have, and also for shoring up the weaknesses. So the strengths and the weaknesses here get back to the strategic capabilities that I was talking about before. So if one of your strategies is to focus on innovation, so you're trying to turn out new products quicker than the competitors, ones that are going to be able to capture larger market share, a key strategic capability is going to be innovation, okay? And that's one of the strengths that you want to focus on. So the analytics would first ask, what is it, you know, about the budgeting decisions that are made, about the organization design decisions, including assigning decision rights, that set you up for success in terms of innovation? Where is it that the money that's being spent is supporting having strength in innovation? Where is it that it's falling short? We don't have all the money in the world, so we have to make decisions about where we're going to spend more versus less. And there's no value judgment there, but it's the role of the analyst, the role of the person doing the analytics, to look at those decisions that are made at the high level and ask, how does that then impact the capability we're trying to build in innovation in this case? Now, if our strength is in innovation, there's going to be weaknesses in other areas. So if this is an organization that's focused a lot on innovation, they're going to have weaknesses in terms of efficiency. That's almost always the case. Okay, so you know the companies that are focused more on, you know, large volume sales of low margin products make a lot of money off of volume and off of efficiency and off of keeping costs down as much as possible. Those kinds of organizations tend to be much weaker in innovation. The companies that are strong in innovation are the opposite, almost the mirror opposite. So they tend to be really good at turning out higher margin new products, high quality ones, but ones where they may suffer a bit in terms of the efficiency with how many pennies they can squeeze out of the manufacturing process. And the strategists are fine with that trade-off, because if we're successful at innovating with high margin products, then we can afford to be a little bit more inefficient in terms of our of volume, because we're making money by the high margins. And this is always the kind of trade-off that our senior leaders are looking at when they're deciding what kind of strategy we should have and what kind of organization design we need to support that. So the task of the analytics in this case is to look at those strategic decisions that are made. What are the organizational capabilities that promote the competitive advantage, and what are the ones that create weaknesses that our competitors could come in and exploit? And ultimately, addressing those strengths, how to bolster the strengths, and addressing the weaknesses, how to shore up the weaknesses, is what we need to be able to contribute to having an impact that really matters to the business. Not just in terms of financial ROI, but strategic capability. So once you've identified what strengths need to be, what are the strengths that need to be bolstered and the weaknesses that have to be shored up, you can then go down to the individual job level and ask what jobs contribute more versus less to those strengths and weaknesses. And that should be the main focus of the analytics. So where is it that if we were to make an improvement in one of our jobs, in the way our teams are working, if we were to make improvements, what would contribute the most to bolstering the strengths and shoring up the weaknesses? That's the kind of focus that you need to figure out, are we actually addressing the fundamental challenges that are keeping us from executing the strategy, keeping us from being effective as an organization to support the strategy, not just in a way that is nice to have. I mean, if you think about it, if you look across all of the hundreds of different kinds of jobs you have in an organization, thousands in some cases, every single job has something that can be improved. Right? So if I'm in HR and I'm asking, what can I do to be useful to the business? And I look at all the different jobs that are out there, I mean, if a job exists, it's there because it has to contribute to it has to contribute to organizational success in one way or another. Whether it's an administrative assistant job, a janitor job, a driver, a day laborer, or a senior vice president, every single job has an important role to play in supporting the strategy. But not all jobs are created equal, and depending on what the weaknesses are in terms of the strengths you're trying to bolster and the weaknesses you're trying to shore up in terms of your strategic capability, there's going to be a much smaller subset of all of those jobs and all those processes that are out there that are going to be the ones that you need to make the improvements on in order to have the biggest impact on strategy. And that ultimately is what the analytics needs to focus on, and not just take it kind of one job at a time and say, well, there's something wrong with this job, so if we fix it, therefore we're going to be having a positive impact. The answer is yes, you may be having a positive impact, but it could be very small and not really that meaningful in terms of improving your competitive advantage. So this slide here takes that point and kind of emphasizes it in terms of what is the cycle you need to be following in order to be able to get to the deeper insights. Okay, so if we start in the upper left, you start with doing the analysis at the organization design level, at the level of how are our budgets being allocated, where are the investments being made. You then look at where is it that the strengths that we're trying to bolster and the weaknesses we're trying to shore up, what are they? Where is it that they need to be improved? You then go down to the individual job and team levels for what are the roles and the teams that are supporting those processes? Where is it that they need to make an improvement? And so this brings us over to the bottom right of the slide. Okay? And so the kinds of questions that you're then asking is, when you're looking at the individual job level, at the team level, you want to know, is the way that the work is designed at that level, are the behaviors that people are exhibiting in those jobs, on those teams, are they consistent with the capabilities that you're trying to improve in order to be able to execute the strategy? Okay? That is not the way that the vast majority of analytics that we do in HR is actually carried out. But it's what you need to do in order to be able to get the kinds of insights we need to improve how HR is operating. Okay? From there, you then get direct implications for the organization design, for annual budgeting, and the investment decisions that are made. Now, of course, many of you are probably sitting there going, well, this all makes sense, Alec, but if we're sitting down in HR, doing our analysis of what's going on with our performance management program or with a particular group of workers, how is it that that's going to actually impact what takes place, in terms of the annual budgeting cycle and the strategy decisions that are made? Well, that's exactly the point that I'm trying to make, is that there needs to be a greater integration on both sides, both on the side of the enterprise analytics, the stuff that's done at the C-suite level, at the strategy level, and the human capital analytics, what we do on the HR side, and that you're only going to get to the deepest insights by having those be integrated in a cycle like this. And just a reminder, if people want to raise any questions, you should go ahead and do the raise hand. I'm happy to take questions at any point during this call. Just going to pause for a second to see if there's any questions. Okay, well, as Carrie said, you can anytime go ahead and speak up if you'd like. So I want to now go into just a couple of applications, or one in particular around human capital.
Hey, Alex, sorry, we do have a hand up now. If you're okay.
Yep, absolutely.
Yep. So let me just unmute the caller lines right now because this one's not associated with a specific name. So one person had their hand up. So if you had your hand up, go ahead and ask your question. We should be able to hear you now.
Thank you. Yeah, this is Roni Unikel from the Walt Disney Company, and I was just curious if you wouldn't mind sharing an example of how you've seen this model and approach playing out in an organization. If you had any examples you could share.
Sure. So I will, in full disclosure, kind of like the mutual fund disclosures, I will say that my colleagues at the center have been doing this work for 35 years. I've been at the center for over 15. What I'm describing here is an ideal that companies need to be aspiring to. Okay, this is not coming out of hundreds of examples of how this plays out. I do have a handful of examples, including a couple that I've led myself. But those are actually the exception that prove the rule for why the vast majority of analytics that are done both on the enterprise side and on the human capital side are typically not integrated in the way they should be. Okay, but there are some exceptions. Some prominent examples. So, for example, when you have a large new initiative where a company has decided that it's going to go into a new line of business and it's decided it's going to succeed there no matter what, that's where you often get this kind of integration. So, for example, when the aerospace companies go into a new rocket launch or a new plane development, like the way that Airbus or Boeing might, like when Boeing did the 787 Dreamliner, and they decided to launch that new program, there was a huge amount of innovation that was involved there, where they decided they were going to bring in and use composites at a much greater extent than ever been done in the past. It wasn't an unproven technology. Composites had been used before, but to do them for civilian aircraft manufacturing, and to the extent that they did, was very new. And there were a bunch of assumptions that were made at the strategy level around what could be accomplished with the program, how much it would cost, and what it was going to take to succeed. Now, as with any new product development, the timelines ended up taking a lot longer. There were a lot greater expense. I'm not going to offer a critique of the kinds of forecasts that are made for that. I mean, that typically always is the case that that problems arise. But even though the problems arose, they still committed to pushing through with it no matter what happened. And in order to be able to solve the problems as they went through, they then had to be looking at what was happening at the individual job level as they ran into manufacturing issues, as they ran into issues with assembly, with using different subcontractors. So at each point in the process, they ran into challenges. They would then drop down into the level of what's going on within the individual teams at the individual job level, figure it out, and then adjust the expectations for the program. Now, so that's one example, and I can give another one from that doesn't come out of new product development, but let me just kind of talk about that for one more minute. That kind of an approach is the exception that proves the rule, because usually when we're approaching some kind of investment, saying there's a particular kind of capability we're trying to build for an organization. In this case, it was the capability for being able to use composites in a much more extensive way than had ever been done before for civilian aircraft manufacturing. So in lots of other cases, the requirements that are put on the business and on HR to show an immediate return often will back you into a corner and to say that it's very difficult to show it because they don't invest enough money at the front end in what you're trying to accomplish down at the level of individual teams. But in the case of the new product development, like the Dreamliner, because they had committed the entire company to be doing this and were very public about it, and in a sense, the cost of going back was much more expensive than dealing with cost overruns from what they'd expected from the outset. That was why they pushed through and did this in an integrated way. What happens much more often is that the assumptions that are made when they're setting annual budgets around what kinds of productivity we can get out from individual workers, they often fall short, and then it's left up to HR to say, you have to go fix it, you have to go figure out how to get people to be more productive, given the amount of money that's been already allocated, and then you're left sitting there holding the bag because you can't always prove that with with your existing processes without changing how resources are spent. So that's the reason why you need to go back to what are the actual assumptions that are made about what kinds of capabilities are we able to deploy with those budgets, with the amount of money being spent, show what the implications are for productivity, and then bring that back to the people at the senior level and say, okay, here is, have the analytics say, here is what is actually preventing us from being able to execute the strategy the way you've set it out there, and where it is we have to be spending more money to be able to improve on that. Now, a different example that comes not out of new product development but out of existing operations, and this is in an article that that was published a while back, in some work that I did with Frito-Lay a number of years ago. We were looking at their go-to-market system. So this is the roles where they transport the product, the chips, from the warehouse to the store, put it out on the shelves, then merchandise it. And without getting into a lot of details around it, they wanted to be able to improve on the productivity of the people in those roles, the people who do the driving and the delivery and the merchandising. And we did a whole analysis of the whole system. So all the different parts, including how they were executing against the different tasks of driving, selling, and merchandising, and what the budgets that they had allocated for compensation, what that meant in terms of the level of skills they could get in at the different for the different kinds of tasks, what it meant to be trying to hire people who could do all three of those things, even though some of those skills are more important than others for driving performance. So in that kind of a setting, for some types of jobs, it turned out that your ability to be able to drive really well, to be able to meet the delivery windows, was critical for improving strategy execution. For some of the other jobs, what mattered more was the sales skills, the ability to be able to get the additional shelf space so that you could get more product out on the store floor. And it was only by looking at the entire system that we were able to figure out what were the bottlenecks to performance that were getting in the way of strategy execution, trace that back to what were the individual skills and motivation that people were bringing to the table, and then from there identify what were the actual changes that had to happen with the jobs, with compensation, with training, with promotions, so that the changes that were made on the HR side were directly supporting the strategic capability. But that was only because we did the whole systems analysis, including looking at what were they trying to accomplish with the different kinds of routes and the different kinds of tasks on the job. There are other examples, which of course I can't, we don't have time to go into right now. But so those are two examples, one from new product development and one from go-to-market systems, where you have to look at the whole system of what you're trying to accomplish, and then dive and go from there at the high level down to, how are you executing against those particular tasks, one job at a time, and that will then tell you where you're going to get the biggest return, the greatest support for your organizational capability.
Thank you. I appreciate you walking through that. The one follow-up question I would have is just, would be great to get a sense of some of the types of analytics you're using in these examples that you're sharing in terms of how you're providing that kind of insight to the leaders.
Yeah, so, great question, and I do apologize that again, in a 1-hour call, there's not very much we can do. I would definitely encourage you to, to look at this seminar that I'm going to be running, because over 2 days' time, I go into this in a lot of detail. It will also be laid out in the book, but that unfortunately won't be available until the fall of next year. But I do very much like the question when you say what types of analytics. There are a lot of people out there, a lot of consulting companies, a lot of solutions providers that are pushing the idea that there's particular kinds of analytics, particular kinds of software or routines, things that that in HR, when we're doing human capital analysis, that are going to give you these wonderful insights. The reality is that the most important thing to do in an analysis like this is to set out what the causal model looks like. Let me go back to that. So writing down what the model is, so what are the different kind of roles that have to come together to produce the ultimate products and services that you're trying to create for your customers, that's one of the first most important things you can do. Now, there's no statistics there. There's not any data crunching. That's actually laying out, like in process maps or in a diagram like this, what are the different things that have to come together in order for you to effectively execute the strategy. So that's the first part of it. The second part is to go to the data that's available that can tell you, are things designed well or not. Okay. So when we are in the top part of this diagram here, when we're looking at the organization design, organization capability, and the culture, organization culture, you're doing analytics on that, but there's very little, if no, statistics involved. Okay? This is a matter of looking at how are things designed and where is it that things are working well and where they are not. The way that you do that kind of analysis is through stakeholder interviews, to figure out where are things designed appropriately, where are they aligned appropriately, and where they aren't, and that's your diagnostic. Okay. A lot of times people mistakenly equate analytics with statistics. Analytics is actually much broader than just statistics. Anytime you analyze a situation, if you go walking into a room and you assess what's the dynamic that's happening there, what kinds of moods are people in, how are people interacting with each other, that's doing analytics. You're analyzing the situation, but you don't need statistics for that. Now, in other cases where you've got lots of data from an employee opinion survey or data on competencies and performance, we can apply some statistics to that, often some high-powered statistics, including multivariate. And where that's appropriate, that absolutely should be part of the analytics. But the way to get to the insights is you start with a causal model, with laying out what is it you're trying to accomplish. You identify the data you need to figure out what's going on in that model, a lot of which is going to come from interviews, some of which is going to come from statistical analysis, and then you use that to identify where it is you need to make improvements. Does that answer your question about the analytics?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. So if other people have questions, they should go ahead and indicate. But in the meantime, let me go, into the application.
We do have a question in the chat box from Rob.
Okay.
He says, can you recommend a methodology to determine the roles that have the greatest strategic impact to provide focus?
Okay. Yes. So the best, well, I don't know if there's any one methodology. So Strategy maps are a good example. So if you go back to Kaplan and Norton and the kinds of methodologies they use when they're creating the balanced scorecard. My colleague John Boudreau, he has a class that he runs on strategy analysis. There are a number of different approaches that can help you figure out where it kind of both what are the roles. So the Kaplan and Norton approach will tell you what are the roles that on average are the ones that are more important for contributing to strategy. John's approach, which is equally important, focuses on marginal contribution. So we can say that Kaplan and Norton focus on average contribution. So if we're talking about like airline pilots versus truck drivers, kind of who on average is more important, for executing the strategy, or more important in terms of an individual role. That kind of analysis, which is the Kaplan and Norton approach, will tell you a lot, will lead you to some fairly obvious conclusions, things like we want to make sure that, pilots are performing well enough so that planes are not falling out of the sky. But then you want to also look at marginal analysis, which is the kind of approach that John advocates, which is to say that regardless of how much roles contribute on average, we want to know, if we were to make a change in any particular role, where is it that we get the biggest improvement in terms of performance? Okay, so for those of you who are more kind of mathematically inclined, this is really about kind of, averages versus first derivatives. If you make a change, where is it you're going to have a bigger impact? And you actually want your methodology, you want to look at both of those at the same time. Now, that's not a very simple approach, but that actually is going to get you to much deeper insights than if you just did only one or the other. Again, I apologize, I can't go into too much detail in this short a time frame, but that's, you can take a look at strategy maps, you can take a look at what John's written on, on looking at on doing the marginal analysis. These also, again, are topics that I take up in my seminar and in my forthcoming book. So again, if you have other questions, feel free to queue them up, but let me go through these last few slides, and then we can come back to additional questions. So if we're talking about evaluating human capital investment, particular, one of the things that we spend a lot of time and energy on is thinking about training and development. And there are two very dominant methodologies that are out there that are used all the time for looking at this. One of them is ROI, but I've already talked about what are some of the challenges of that. I mean, it focuses too much on cash flow and really is not a great measure to be because of the emphasis on monetary values. Now, another one, which many of you are probably familiar with, is Kirkpatrick, which is perhaps one of the oldest HR analytic methodologies that's out there. It's one of the earliest ones, dating back to the 1950s, I believe. And it's very seductive in its kind of in its rigor, and it's become, I'd say probably the dominant approach that most people who try to evaluate training and development will take. But it's actually very deficient in terms of what you can actually learn from it. Okay. So the question is, why is that? Well, the main point is that there are 4 stages in the Kirkpatrick evaluation. So the first is it's the old kind of smiley face approach, right? You give them a survey, you ask them how do they feel about the program, and I think that kind of approach, almost everybody today recognizes is not enough. Okay, so the next step advocated by Kirkpatrick is you look at, did they actually learn the skills? Third step, do they apply the skills on the job? And then ultimately, is there a business impact? Now, logically, if people didn't learn the skills, then obviously the training program couldn't have been effective. And if they learn the skills but they don't apply them on the job, then it also can't be effective. So the logic of it is incredibly compelling. I mean, of course we'd want to show, did they learn the skills, do they apply them on the job? The problem is that from a cost-benefit perspective, those 2 steps are incredibly difficult to implement. I mean, it is virtually impossible in a cost-effective way to prove that people learn the skills and that they're applying them on the job. So while it seems like a great approach, practically it doesn't provide very much value at all. And in fact, if you ask people who have been trained in the Kirkpatrick methodology, how often do they get to measuring business impact, the answer is almost never. And if they do, they're probably measuring it in terms of some kind of financial impact like ROI. Okay? But the problem is that neither one of those approaches, neither Kirkpatrick nor nor ROI, will tell you how the training and development program ultimately is helping with your competitive advantage. Okay? And so the problem with Kirkpatrick in particular is that it's focused too much on purity of measurement. So it's a great idea, and I say this as a reformed academic. So I came out of academe. I spent many years working as a kind of traditional researcher, in fact, in labor economics, looking at traditional program evaluation. And the kind of approach advocated by Kirkpatrick is textbook academic. And it's a really wonderful, great methodology, but it's not practical because it's focused too much on the purity of the things that we'd like to measure, even if they're not practical. So what you want to focus on instead is what are the business impacts that matter, okay? Not just what are the skills that we would like to develop because we might like to improve them. Again, think back to every single job in our organizations, every single job we can make an improvement. Anybody could be helped by training. Okay? So if you ask, can this training be helpful? Does it have some kind of a positive impact? You can spend hours. You can spend days, weeks, months, years evaluating everything you're doing, and you can be, finding a little bit of marginal benefit here, a little bit of marginal benefit there, because you're looking one job at a time. But that's focusing analysis in all the wrong places. You need to start with what are the actual organizational capabilities you're trying to build, not with the individual competencies required by a job. If you start with the individual competencies required by a job, and are we meeting all those competencies, the answer will always be no. I mean, we're never able to hire people who can satisfy 100% of the competencies in a role. But if we want to know from a training development functions perspective, where is it we should be focusing our attention? Where is it we're going to get the biggest bang for our resources and the biggest contribution for helping the business? It's not by looking at it one job at a time and in individual competency by individual competency. You need to go up to a much higher level. Start with what are the actual organizational capabilities you're trying to build. Figure out the ones where you need to make the biggest improvements to support competitive advantage, and then drop down to the individual competencies that help that. So, for example, if innovation is what we're trying to build as an organizational capability, if innovation gives us competitive advantage, then R&D skills, of course, is one of the things we want to look at, but hiring the best R&D scientists is never a guarantee that you're going to get innovation, right? There's many more things that we have to do effectively in order to have innovation, and having people with the right individual skills is just one part of that. But the analytics need to be asking, where is it that we need to improve in terms of everything we're doing for innovation? It may be that hiring people with better individual competencies is the right answer. It may be that we're doing just fine there, and we shouldn't spend another dime on that. Okay. If customer service is something that gives us competitive advantage in terms of customer retention, increased sales, longer sales cycles, then if you look, one of the individual competencies that contributes to that is sales skills. So what do the individual salespeople have to contribute? But the whole sales process. So what are all the different roles, all the different people that have to come together to create an effective sales process, give people the products and services you're trying to deliver? That's what ultimately creates customer service. It's not just the skills of the individual salesperson or the individual, customer service representative who might be answering questions over the phone. When we're talking about leadership and effective leadership, a lot of what we measure is observed behaviors. So what we have in our leadership competency models, what we put into 360 evaluations is observed leadership behaviors, yet some of the most important decisions that leaders have is the quality of decisions that they make. And that's something that is virtually impossible to measure, but is one of the most important things for organizational effectiveness. So we don't want to get distracted by looking only at things like leadership behaviors and thinking that's all we need in order to have effective leadership, when it's decision-making quality among a number of other things that is important for actually delivering the organizational capability we need. Okay. So these are all examples of ways in which you need to be focusing on the larger organizational capability and not just on the individual role and the competencies for that role, which is what traditional evaluation approaches for training and development tend to focus on. So with that, I'll just put up a slide again for the seminar I have coming up at the end of January. Are there any other questions that people have?
There is a question in the chat box from Bob. He says, research at Stanford has shown that we should focus on strengths and leverage these to improve on weaknesses and not spend a lot of time on weaknesses solely. So is this also true of organizational capabilities?
So I assume you're talking about individual level research. I mean, I need to know more about that, but I think I can understand what the implication is. So, well, first of all, we can always get a drink and go talk about what that research has to show. There are lots of different individual pieces of research about individual effectiveness, and I would say that it's contextually important. So in some cases, focusing on your strengths may be important, but in other cases, being able to shore up weaknesses at an individual level can be more important. This is actually one of the problems with competency models in general, is trying to come up with a one-size-fits-all solution when, in fact, the answer often depends on the context that you're in. The behaviors that are being measured there are being measured over a year's time. But they don't tell you, are you applying the right competencies in the right situation? So that's at the individual level. At the organizational level, just think about what it is that actually creates competitive advantage for your company. Okay. I mean, the biggest problem that senior leaders tend to focus on is overemphasizing strengths. So what are we really good at doing? You emphasize the heck out of it. You push on that. You push, and push. But if you push too much and don't shore up your weak side, don't shore up where it is that competitors can come in and actually take advantage of where you are not strong, that also can hurt you in terms of competitive advantage. Now, there's no one formula that says you should focus 80% of your effort on your strengths and 20% on your weaknesses. I mean, it's going to depend a lot on what kinds of alignment you can get from senior leadership. But from the analytics perspective, your job is not to make that decision for senior leaders. Your job is to look at what is actually happening in the organization. Where is it that you are supporting the strengths well? Where is it that you are addressing the weaknesses or not addressing them? And then you lay that out for the senior leaders to see. That's what the analytics needs to do, is to point out both from the high level of where are spending dollars going, where are we investing, what does that lead to in terms of how much we're emphasizing the strengths versus weaknesses, but then dropping down to into the job and the process level, where is it that things are going well and where aren't they? Where is it that we can make improvements that would either bolster the strengths or shore up the weaknesses? And then you present that back to the senior leaders to decide, okay, well, how is it that we want to then reallocate the spending that we might have initially thought should go in a different direction? That's the role of the analytics. So with that, I would definitely encourage people. I'm very happy to kind of communicate with you offline, have you come to the seminar, or as Ed said, if you're not a member of, not a sponsor of the center, we'd be very happy to have you join us. And with that, we're done for today.
Thanks so much, Alec, for a great webinar. Everyone have a great day.